Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 12. As always, we're intended for half PPR on this channel, and we're going to start with all the players who are injured, not available, on IR. All these guys on the screen: Chris Godwin, Rashee Rice, Stephon Diggs, Ayuk, Olave, Shaheed, Bub Means, Christian Kirk, Josh Reynolds might return, but didn't rank him, Allen Lazard, Brandon Cooks, and Marquise Brown, all unranked this week. But we also have 6 teams on bye, and you can't start these players either. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Andre Yoshivas of the Bengals, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod of the Falcons, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams of the Jets, Keon Coleman, Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and Matt Collins of the Bills, Brian Thomas Jr., Parker Washington, and Gabe Davis of the Jaguars, and lastly, Cedric Wilson, Marquez Valdez-Scantling of the Saints. A lot of players are unranked this week. But I think more disappointing than these players on bye is the matchups that are also on bye. We have 4 top 12 matchups for receivers that are unavailable. The Falcons are number 2, the Saints number 7, and then the Bengals at 10, Jaguars at 12. So the position I think might underperform a little bit overall this week. I think if you have one of those few difference makers that can go over 20 points, that advantage at receiver might put you over the top. But we also aren't missing any bad matchups. The Jets at 23, the Bills at 20. Neither of them rank bottom 8. So kind of concerning. Receiver not great this week. Let's get into it though. Let's find out where I rank all those players. At number 1, we're going with Amon-Ra St. Brown, a dominant performance last week with 2 touchdowns. That gives him 8 straight games with a touchdown, 9 touchdowns total in that stretch. So if Laporta misses again, I would expect double-digit targets for St. Brown once more, but no matter what, you get a touchdown. St. Brown is the most bust-proof option this week. At number 2, I have Mike Evans at the Giants, who's expected to return off that hamstring injury. They didn't place him on IR for a reason. So expect him to suit up. It looks like he was already limited in practice on Wednesday, and that's great news. That hamstring should not be a factor. So definitely starting Evans with no Chris Godwin. The volume should be elite, and he was already playing great before Godwin went down. Evans is one of the safest bets for a touchdown in the NFL. So definitely starting him against the Giants. There are no concerns. He should go over 100 yards and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill versus the New England Patriots, though, I rank at number 3, and I am ready to endorse Tyreek once again. Maybe not every single week this high, but I feel very confident in starting him because especially at home, he plays very well against New England with Tua in Miami. If we look at the last 5 games versus the Patriots, his average is already pretty decent, 12.9 points per game in those 5 career games with the Dolphins. So pretty safe floor in the first place. However, specifically in Miami against the Patriots at home, Tyreek goes off, an average of 17.3 points per game, 12.5 targets, 8 catches, 103 yards, and 1 touchdown. His best games in this divisional matchup are at home. So that's where this game is, in Miami, and that's why I'm definitely trusting him. While he is dealing with a wrist injury, he played through it last few weeks. When we hit Sunday, another week removed, he's probably going to deal with less pain in his wrist as well. So definitely trusting him, not worried about it. And in his last 4 games, he's now back inside the top 20 overall at receiver. So more encouraged. He found pay dirt last week, and I think this offense is starting to get rolling. So against a bad team, Patriots also rank as a top 14 matchup. Definitely one of the better matchups you can find this week. They allow 158 yards per game on 11.2 catches, 6 touchdowns to the position. I do believe Tyreek Hill will score a touchdown this week. So he probably goes over 100 yards. That's what he normally does versus New England. I would start him with a lot of confidence. I think this week he's back in the elite top 5. At number 4, I have A.J. Brown at the Rams, who I know has been disappointing the last month with no touchdowns. That is annoying. His ceiling has been capped, but the floor is still pretty high, 74 yards per game. Not a ton of volume, only 6.3 targets, 4.3 catches per game, but still 9.5 points with no touchdowns. That is bust-proof. No one's benching A.J. Brown. And the matchup against the Rams is top 8, and they did just trade away Tre'Davious White. Maybe it's even better without him. So A.J. Brown should be dominant. The Rams allow 6 touchdowns to the position, 154 yards per game on only 10.6 catches. So they are vulnerable to the deep pass. 14.5 yards per catch is what they allow on average. So just under 30 points per game. The Rams are a very good matchup, one of the better ones this week. I do trust A.J. Brown to pay off. I think he gets back in the end zone after a month without it. Number 5, I'm ranking CeeDee Lamb here at the Washington Commanders, and the matchup is scary. Ranks bottom 2 as of late. The Dan Quinn defense has been elite in recent history. They only give up 18 points per game, 9 catches, 101 yards, 2 touchdowns to receivers, but honestly, all of those yards could go to Lamb. Wouldn't be shocked at all. There's not many other players in this offense. We saw Kevontae Turpin bust a big play, but other than that, there's really no one, especially if Ferguson is inactive with that concussion. So Lamb in his last 4 games, most of these snaps are with Cooper Rush, averaging 12.8 targets per game, 8.8 catches, 84 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The wide receiver 3 this week in terms of eligible players and points per game. So 15.8, definitely trusting that volume to keep the floor high. I cannot bench CeeDee Lamb, but obviously without Dak Prescott, he's not the wide receiver 1. At number 6 in the rankings, I have Justin Jefferson at the Bears, and I am a little concerned about this divisional matchup, especially on the road. If we look at the last 2 road games at Chicago since his rookie season, Jefferson has been locked up. 9.3 points per game on only 4 catches per game, 43 yards per game, and without a touchdown, you would be screwed not even getting 6.5 points from JJ in that sample size. So a little concerned. Obviously, Jauan Jennings, one of the better corners in the NFL, and like A.J. Brown, Jefferson has not found the end zone in the last month either. Darnold is still sending him a lot of volume, 8.8 targets per game. Jefferson is averaging 95 yards on 6.5 catches per game. So very safe high floor. I still trust Jefferson, but the matchup's not good, and I would worry that he doesn't find the end zone for the 5th straight week in Minnesota. So against the Bears at home, he plays a lot better, averages 18.2 points per game in 3 career home games versus Chicago, and in the 2 previous road games, 9.3 points. So I'm a little worried about it, but obviously it's Jefferson. Are you really going to bench him? I wouldn't panic at the end of the day, but the matchup is bottom 10. Jalen Johnson is a legit concern. But at number 7, also in the must-start territory, I have Terry McLaurin versus Dallas, who was disappointing against the Eagles last week, but Quinyon Mitchell, potentially the defensive rookie of the year, a really elite corner, definitely a nightmare to go up against. So definitely expect a bounce back for Terry this week. He goes from the worst matchup in the league to now a top 6 matchup the last 5 weeks. The Cowboys can't really stop anyone, giving up 31 points per game. The Eagles the last 5 weeks average like 12.7. So literally like almost 3 times as more, and Terry should be dominant. They allow 166 yards per game, 6 touchdowns to the position on 11.4 catches. That is a very high yards per reception number as well. I think Terry will break a deep pass this week. So although Jaden Daniels is a bit banged up still with that rib injury, not 100%. I think another week removed from it definitely helps with the soreness and the pain tolerance, and it shouldn't impact him. Off a mini bye week with extra rest and time to plan, I do trust Terry. He will get back in the end zone. So last week felt like a fluke, definitely just matchup driven. If we're buying into matchups, this one is definitely a place to start Terry. But I will mention this, he only has 1 touchdown the last 5 games versus the Cowboys. This season feels different, though. With a better quarterback, I think he'll get back in the end zone. Just like Terry, I'm also starting Nico Collins with a lot of confidence this week versus the Titans, and last week with only 54 yards was a little disappointing, but only because his first catch of the game was nullified by penalty. There was an O-lineman a little too deep down the field, and it took off a 77-yard touchdown from the box score. So Nico Collins off a hamstring. I didn't really want to see him run the length of the field, but he was able to do it. He probably was a bit sore after that, probably not 100% rest of the game, but still, I'm kind of looking at him as if that did actually happen. And if it did, you would have had an elite game. You would have gotten an extra 15 points, basically, if you counted that catch. So definitely still trusting Nico. He's still dominant, and although last week with 54 yards wasn't great, it was never in question against Dallas. They were in cruise control and no reason to really force the issue with Nico. That touchdown was their plan to get him involved. After that, they probably expected to cool it a little bit. So still starting him. I'm not worried about it at all. Nico's still elite. He's the wide receiver 7 in points per game his last 4, averaging 15 points per game. So gonna still start him. The matchup against the Titans is bottom 10, but I don't care at all. Nico, I believe, is matchup proof. It's just a question of that hamstring holding up. At number 9, I have Jauan Jennings at Green Bay, and holy shit, another game with 11 targets. This role looks very much locked up for him in San Francisco. I was super high on Ayuk entering the season, and now it appears the role I envisioned is finally materializing for Jauan Jennings. So that's excellent. Definitely believe he's the number one go-to target, the clear receiver to start in San Francisco. I apologize on Deebo. I'll get to him later in the video, but have no concerns. Since his injury, he's been dominant, 16.5 points per game, is only second this week to Amon-Ra St. Brown among eligible players. So 100% start him. The matchup does rank bottom 3 against the Packers, but last week Jair Alexander did exit early, and it's possible it happens again. But still, they have some other corners aside from him, and it is a downgrade in general. They only give up 105 yards per game to receivers. The Packers are a tough spot. So Jennings, not like a top 5 play, but honestly this season I think he's a clear lock in your lineup. As long as Purdy is available, I would be starting Jennings no matter what. At number 10, I think you're also starting Puka Nacua no matter what, but you have to downgrade every receiver against the Eagles this season. Their defense is just playing way too well to ignore, and Quinyon Mitchell, while he is a rookie, can definitely lock up Puka Nacua. Just ask Terry how difficult of a matchup this is against the Eagles. So not only is their secondary playing very well, they have extra rest for this game, and in prime time, I do worry about it a little bit. There's a chance the Eagles defense does win by blowout, but obviously it's the Rams offense. Inevitably they will get going, and these pass catchers are just too good. I still trust Stafford to probably pay off. So while I do downgrade Puka, I want to rank him top 5 given his production this season. I cannot do it. I'm downgrading him to number 10. You're not benching him, but don't expect his best game of the year. Quinyon Mitchell is legit, but aside from that, that's the only red flag. Puka's been way too good. No one is benching Nacua. Number 11, I have Jaxon Smith-Njigba versus Arizona, and if we recall, he was kind of bad as a rookie, but one of his best games came against the Arizona Cardinals at home last year, Week 7, 2023 at home. JSN scored 14.3 points, 7 targets, 4 catches, 63 yards, and a touchdown. So I've mentioned these home road splits, especially for receivers. I think they're very indicative of what to expect, and I do trust that number to go up for JSN. As a rookie, he was not the same player as he's been the last month. If we look at the last 4 games, holy shit, JSN is on fire, averaging 15.7 points per game. This week, among all eligible receivers, that ranks top 5 at the position. So really good performances, 9.3 targets, 6.5 catches, 94 yards, and 2 touchdowns. While 2 of those games, Metcalf was off the field, the last 2 weeks, those numbers have continued. JSN looks like the number 1 target for Geno Smith. So it's taken a while, but honestly, I've always felt that Metcalf has been a little overrated, and I was a big fan of JSN entering last year's draft. Love to see him live up to his potential. So he looks like a true stud, and if he dominated the Cardinals as a rookie, I think he'll be even better if this target share goes up potentially to 11 targets once again. So definitely trusting him. I don't think Metcalf is the guy to start anymore. I'm still considering Metcalf in my lineup, but if I'm starting one, no matter what, it would be JSN. Love his production the last month. Number 12, I have George Pickens at Cleveland, and Pickens is a top 10 receiver the last month himself, averaging 15 points per game on 8.3 targets, 5.5 catches, 92 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It's not like leaps and bounds better than it was with Fields, but it's definitely much better for fantasy now that the touchdowns are hitting at a decent rate, about 50-50 chances for a touchdown with Pickens. But last week he had an elite matchup and didn't do as well as we thought. I thought he'd be like a top 5 play potentially. That didn't happen. He did not go over 100 yards against Baltimore, but that was a weird game. I think this game against Cleveland might bounce back. In terms of offense, I think it will look a little better against the Browns, but maybe not that elite. It's still an AFC North divisional game after all, and on Thursday, sometimes they are low scoring. So could be a little rough, but Pickens is clearly the only receiver to start in Pittsburgh. Not going to worry about it at all. Definitely trusting him. The Browns have actually been a top 4 matchup the last 5 weeks. So on paper, it's an upgrade, but if we look at the division splits for Pickens, both of his touchdowns in this sample size did happen in the home games. On the road, he has under 40 yards in both of those career games. An average of 5.6 points per game on the road at Cleveland versus Cleveland at home, an average of 17.7. So I'm a bit worried that these home road splits are very indicative of what to expect, but given Pickens has been so good and clearly no other player threatens him for targets, I'm not going to panic about Denzel Ward. I think odds are he does play well and probably puts up his typical average of over 10 points. So going to trust him. He's been so good lately. I don't think you can bench George Pickens. At number 13, I have Zay Flowers at the Chargers, and I'm definitely starting Flowers. The matchup does rank top 9. The Chargers allow 29.7 points per game on 12 catches, 153 yards, and 7 touchdowns, but a lot of that damage did just happen against the Bengals. Before that, they did not rank anywhere near this bad. So it's a little bit misleading, this top 10 matchup, but on paper, it does rank top 10. And I wouldn't worry about it too much. With Flowers, you know what you're getting. There's going to be some random games where he disappears for whatever reason. The game plan just doesn't focus on him. And when that doesn't happen, he will be lights out. So 100% starting Flowers. There is a weird aspect of like competition here with the Harbaugh Bowl as a factor. Maybe, just maybe, the Chargers defense does play as well as the Steelers just did last week, but I really doubt it. I still think Flowers is a must start. At number 13 this week, I do think he should be in your lineup. At number 14, I have Ladd McConkey in the exact same game, and this matchup is elite. The Ravens rank number 1 this season, and the last 5 games giving up 36 points per game, 14.2 catches, 204 yards per game, and 7 touchdowns to opposing receivers. Ladd, or should I say Ladidi, is playing elite football lately, clearly the number 1 target for Justin Herbert, and he's really coming on strong, over 120 yards last week. So even if he doesn't score a touchdown, which generally doesn't happen for McConkey, he still has a very high floor, 88 yards per game on under 5 catches the last 5 weeks. So the volume isn't like massive, but when he does catch it, they're all down the field, and he picks up big chunk plays every single time. So really trust him as a very reliable option. They leaned on him in the final drive to set up that J.K. Dobbins touchdown to seal the game. So really trust McConkey. He is by far the number 1 receiver in this offense, very talented, and maybe the touchdown doesn't hit, but the floor is very safe. His last 4 games, he averages 14.1 points, and if you remove the touchdowns from the equation, you're still getting 11 points as a floor. So definitely start McConkey in the best matchup possible. He's a clear top 15 receiver, in my opinion. At number 15, I'm still starting Cooper Kupp versus the Eagles, but similar to Puka, I think he does deserve a downgrade. Maybe he's actually the one that will draw most of the Quinyon Mitchell coverage, because I do think Nacua will be moved around all game. He'll play in the slot, whereas Kupp might not be moved around as much. So even if Kupp doesn't face off against Quinyon Mitchell, he still gets Cooper DeJean instead, and maybe Darius Slay also relives some of the glory days. So a tough matchup here, definitely the worst in the NFL, and in general, I would downgrade this offense overall, but it's still the Rams. Odds are the Eagles turn this game into a shootout, and the only way to hang is for Stafford to throw for like 400. So that could break open this game plan, and like last week, we could see a 70-yard touchdown for Cooper Kupp, but definitely starting him. He's been fantastic this season. His last 4 games since being healthy, he is the wide receiver 2, averaging 16.7 points per game among all eligible receivers this week. So definitely start him. I can't downgrade him, but I would trust Puka a bit more. The matchup against the Eagles is terrible. At number 16, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. at Seattle, and I would start Marvin this week. It's a top 5 matchup versus Seattle. Obviously, we don't have any previous matchups in division because it's his rookie year, but off the bye, typically rookie receivers get a little more established in the offense. So maybe his target share goes up. In his last 4 games, he is averaging 10 points per game on 5.8 targets, 4 catches, 55 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 fumble. That's the wide receiver 28 in points per game. So a bit more of a flex play, but I think the ceiling will be unlocked this week. The Seahawks are a top 5 matchup, giving up 31.9 points per game, 14.6 catches, 171 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I think Harrison will be fine. So there's not many other targets to throw the ball to in the first place. Other than McBride and Harrison, there's no threat. I think he'll be a top 20 play this week. I would start Marv against the Seahawks. Number 17, I have Malik Nabers versus the Buccaneers, and Nabers in his last 4 games is not quite great. Similar to Marvin, just a lower end flex play, averaging 55 yards per game as well, but not a single touchdown. The volume, though, is way higher. 10.5 targets is like double what you're seeing for Harrison, but 6.5 catches per game means they're mostly checkdowns. 55 yards is pretty mediocre on 6.5 catches. So it's mostly just a floor for Nabers. The ceiling we hoped for in the first few weeks was not quite emblematic of what the rest of his season has been, but similar to Harrison off a bye, maybe he gets even more established. Now we get a new quarterback. Perhaps Tommy DeVito does get things going. I think he's a bit better down the field. I think there's a bit more excitement this week with a new quarterback. So that's why I'm still starting Nabers. I'm not going to completely panic, but if we only look at the stats from him, he's just a floor play, good for 8.5. He does not score touchdowns as of late. So a little worried about it. The ceiling's a bit capped without it, but this matchup does rank top 12. The Buccaneers give up over 29 points per game on 11.6 catches, 153 yards per game with 6 wide receiver touchdowns to the position. So I think he finally gets back in the end zone, and I think he will approach 100 yards. I don't know if he goes over 100 yards, but I think he will do better than 55 like he's been averaging the last 4. So I would start Nabers at 17. I like the matchup a lot. And number 18, I have Calvin Ridley at Houston, who's been a dominant player, actually ranks top 10 in scoring over the last month. Ridley is putting up 14.5 points per game. So if you have him and you've been starting him, you've been laughing to the bank. He's been excellent. And although he has fumbled, he also has a game with 2 touchdowns and 90 yards per game on average. So although Nick Westbrook-Akine was the better start last week, Ridley was still pretty good, and he's been a safe option overall as of late. Very reliable in fantasy since they've traded away DeAndre Hopkins. The matchup against the Texans also ranks top 2. While it is in division, maybe Derek Stingley does step up. On paper, it's a very good spot for Ridley to capitalize. They allow 32 points per game, 11.3 catches, 167 yards per game, and 7 wide receiver touchdowns. Their secondary has not quite stepped up this year. So I do think Ridley is a safe play this week. I'm not quite ready to believe he's actually going to be top 10 every single week, no matter what. All of those touchdowns came in the same game. Otherwise, he rarely does actually score. So I don't actually believe he'll give you that like 20-point game again, not reliably, but I still think a 10, 11-point floor is safe to project. I do trust Ridley in general because of the volume. The target share is insane. So I do think he's a safe play, and perhaps one of the reasons why they targeted him in free agency was because of his track record against the Texans in 3 career games against Houston with both the Falcons and Jaguars. He averages 13.4 points per game on the Texans, 7.3 targets, 4.3 catches, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think he'll be okay. I think he possibly gets back in the end zone. The Texans defense does not scare you that much at receiver. So I would start him at number 18. I think he's earned your trust. I think he's a top 20 play this week. At number 19, I also think Josh Downs has earned your trust. More of a volume receiver as well, but still there's always some touchdown upside in this Colts offense. Downs the last 4 weeks averages 13.9 points per game. That's wide receiver 12 in scoring. 8.3 targets, 5.5 catches, 81 yards. Very high floor. 2 touchdowns himself as well. So similar to Ridley, I trust the 8-point safety net of the yardage. And given how well he's stepped up lately, I do think he's one of the safer bets in this offense to actually find the end zone. He does play very well. Looks like the number 1 receiver in Indianapolis. So I like him a lot. I do trust him. I kind of feel like he's the new Christian Kirk in fantasy. You expect at least a high floor from Downs. Maybe he doesn't score a touchdown every week, but even without it, you probably get 6 for 65, and that's good for 9, 10 points. I do trust Downs a lot. The Lions, though, have only given up 3 wide receiver touchdowns the last 5 games. I'm not totally convinced Downs will score in this game. But at 20, I'm also starting Courtland Sutton at Las Vegas, another bust-proof option in my opinion. Sutton is averaging 14.3 points in his last 4 games. He's been a revelation. Bo Nix is really stepping up and getting him the ball at a high rate. 9.5 targets for Sutton, 7 catches, 93 yards, and a touchdown those last 4 games. That is the wide receiver 10 in that sample size among all active receivers this week. So maybe it's closer to 15 if we don't have any buys this week, but still very impressive. 14 points from Sutton is not what you expected, especially given it's not as touchdown dependent as last season. So kind of a best case scenario. You don't have to worry about the touchdowns hitting or not with Sutton. The floor is kind of safe no matter what. He's gone over 10 fantasy points in like 6 straight games. So Sutton is very safe, very reliable, although the matchup here is actually very bad. The Raiders don't sound like a tough spot, but over the last 5 weeks, they do rank bottom 4 against the receiver position, only giving up 19.2 points per game, 9.8 catches, 99 yards per game, less than 100 yards is impressive on their end. But 3 touchdowns as well. Sutton might find pay dirt, but it's not that safe of a bet. I do worry about this matchup a little bit. I wanted to rank him higher, but when I looked at the matchup stats, I did downgrade him, especially given his last 3 games versus Las Vegas with Sean Payton as head coach. Sutton is only averaging 5.4 points per game the last 3 games versus the Raiders. 4.7 targets, 2.3 catches, 22 yards, and 1 touchdown. 22 yards is brutal. I would be a bit worried if these numbers repeat. Even in week 5 with Bo Nix, Sutton only caught 2 catches for 32 yards. He gave you 4.2 points. Other than the bagel against the Saints, that's his worst game in quite a while. So Sutton could burn you this week. I worry about these matchup stats, but Nate Hobbs is likely out for the 2nd week in a row, and he's their best corner. If that's the case, then the downgrade probably doesn't apply that much. So Bo Nix has really stepped up, looked great lately, and I still trust him. I still think Sutton is a very safe option, similar to Josh Downs and Ridley. I would start him with some confidence. At number 21, I'm going to swing for the fence. Here's where I rank Jameson Williams at the Colts. While he only averages 10.9 points the last 4 games, that's wide receiver 24, you know it's boom bust variance with JMO. You're either getting less than 5 points most of the time or more than 15. Last week, he went over 120 yards and a touchdown, and you could get a 60-plus yard touchdown any given game from JMO. So against the Colts, why not bet on it, especially if Laporta is out once again? You have to start one of those top 4 weapons for Detroit. Their offense is way too good, and it's way too narrow. You know exactly where the ball is going. It's either going to the running backs, Gibbs, Montgomery, or Amon-Ra St. Brown. Everything else, the first read would be Jameson Williams after those 3. So definitely start JMO. Love his floor. Don't say that often for him, but with no Laporta, I think he's safe for at least 50 yards once again, and the ceiling is always open. Number 22, I have Jerry Jeudy versus Pittsburgh. Sorry, I kicked the tripod right there, but right behind Jeudy, I do have Cedric Tillman versus Pittsburgh, and last week I did rank Tillman in the top 10. Jeudy had the excellent game. Meanwhile, Elijah Moore scored the other touchdown. Tillman didn't go over 50 yards, but why I'm not worried about Tillman is because this offense throws the ball like crazy. There were 8 targets for both Tillman and Elijah Moore. There were another 10 for Jeudy. So it's 2 straight games where Jeudy has been the number 1 target. And given the contract they paid him after the trade, yeah, it probably makes a bit more sense why they'd want to get him involved and established the most. But I still think Tillman is very, very good. I'm ranking them back to back here because I think the touchdown can go to either of them. And if you take out the 89-yard catch from Jeudy, and let's say it was just like a regular 20-yard reception, and that was actually a scoring drive that they had to go 7 plays deep in order to score. Some of those other plays would have been targets for Tillman. I really don't think Tillman is going to disappear for an entire half every single week. So Tillman, since Jameis Winston has been the quarterback since they've traded away Amari Cooper, has been the better player, getting 10 targets per game. Jeudy right behind him, though, at 8.8. And they're both on par with each other at 78, 76 yards apiece. But Tillman also has 3 touchdowns. That is more than Jeudy with only 1. So I do still trust Tillman, but obviously the targets have slightly favored Jeudy the last couple games. I'm going to rank them back to back against the Steelers. It's not a good matchup, but I still think Winston will be throwing it way too much to bench these options. I still trust the floor a lot with both Cleveland Browns' top 2 receivers. I think Elijah Moore is not far behind them, but I still believe Jeudy and Tillman are the top 2. Those are the 2 I would covet the most. Elijah Moore, though, a very legit pickup off the wire, will rank him in a few minutes. So start Tillman and Jeudy, I think, as a floor play, very high-end flex options, low-end wide receiver 2s rest of season. At number 24, I have DeAndre Hopkins at Carolina, and Hopkins, his last 4 games with the Chiefs, is averaging 11.1 points with 2 touchdowns. It's a little touchdown dependent, however. If you've been starting him when he doesn't score, he's kind of disappointing. So last week was more of a Xavier Worthy game, and it could pivot back to Travis Kelce, but odds are Kelce and Hopkins get back in the mix pretty soon. So maybe it was just the Bills defense that really shut them down. I don't worry that much about the Chiefs offense. Hopkins should still be fine. So he's not as volatile as Worthy. I still trust him from a floor standpoint. And the Panthers, while they are a bottom 5 matchup, I really don't care. I'm not that worried. But where you might be concerned is that they only give up 1 touchdown to the position the last 5 games. So maybe Hopkins does not score, but in general, he's a pretty good investment. If you play with Mahomes and you're usually the receiver 1, I would expect that to be a top 30 play. So going to rank him here at 24. Given all the teams on bye, I think he's a safe floor play at flex. At number 25, I have DeVonta Smith at the Rams. And like I mentioned with A.J. Brown, this is a top 10 matchup. The Rams give up 14.5 yards per catch this season. So really excited for the upside with Smith. We all know he needs just 1 deep catch to hit. However, he's a bit touchdown dependent, and I do feel like this is a bit more of an A.J. Brown game. It's been a while since Brown has paid off, so maybe they want to get him right, and that could impact DeVonta, but in general, there's still enough value to keep starting DeVonta in your lineup. He's been a pretty good option, averaging 10.4 points the last 4 games. And this week, that does rank as wide receiver 25 in points per game. So that's here where I ranked him at 25. If the touchdown hits, you'll probably get a top 15 receiver. If it doesn't, he'll probably still put up top 35-ish numbers. So a decent floor play, a little volatile, but safe enough to trust. The talent is there most of the time. At number 26, a similar type of player is Tank Dell versus Tennessee, and a little touchdown dependent as well. But given Stephon Diggs is out of the equation, I do trust the volume to continue going back to Tank Dell. Last week, he did have 54 yards on 4 catches, the same stat line in the receiving game as Nico, and I think they'll have a similar role every single week. So sometimes it'll pivot to Dell, who scores a touchdown. Sometimes it'll be Nico. I definitely trust Nico as the better play rest of season, but the upside is equally as high for Tank Dell in this offense. So the matchup's not terrible. It's bottom 10, but the Titans don't scare you that much. Meanwhile, Tank Dell did miss both games last year versus Tennessee, and I don't have any matchup stats to point to. So he could be bad. He could be fine. I think in general, he gives you what you expect, and that's somewhere around wide receiver 26, around 10 points per game. Number 27, I'm ranking DJ Moore versus Minnesota, who I'm bringing back in the flex conversation, but a little hesitant to fully endorse because he has been bad this season. The last 4 games especially, he's been terrible. An average of 6 points per game, no touchdowns, only 40 yards receiving per game. That doesn't even rank top 50 this week at the position. So brutal numbers from DJ Moore, but with the new offensive coordinator, they looked a little better on offense last week, and he did catch all 7 of his targets. They weren't checkdowns either. With Keenan, they were all checkdowns. Rome did see the most targets, but DJ Moore did catch the most passes last week. So DJ Moore, still a decent option. I'm bringing him back into the mix, but at 27, he's not like the safest start in general, just a flex play. But the matchup does rank top 13. The Vikings do give up 160 yards per game to the position, just under 29 points per game in fantasy. So I do think he's fine. Last season against the Vikings, one of those games was with Tyson Bagent. However, the other one with Justin Fields, he caught 11 catches for 110 yards. That was on the road at Minnesota. So if that's what you're getting this week, then I'm ranking him way too low, but I want to see it one more time. DJ Moore has not been good enough to trust. Last week was encouraging, but still with no touchdowns, I don't think he's the best fantasy play in general, but at 27, odds are he'll probably sniff your flex spot. 28, I have Jakobi Meyers versus Denver, who's a decent floor play, but last week actually did burn you. Jakobi did not live up to expectation, where normally he gets like 9 targets per game. But if we look at the last 3 career games versus the Broncos with the Raiders, Jakobi actually dominates this matchup. He averages 16.1 points per game on 8 targets, 6 catches, 71 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He plays lights out. And even in week 5, he put up 10.2 points, 6 catches, 72 yards, and Adams did not play in that matchup. So pretty similar expectation this week. I think 10 points is probably a decent floor, but last week he did burn you, so I'm a little hesitant to totally buy in. It's kind of hard to believe that he owns Patrick Surtain this bad. So maybe it really burns you, but the matchup stats are what they are. You might be getting an elite game from Jakobi if these numbers repeat. So 8 targets, 6 catches is actually what I do expect from him. That's what he's averaging the last 4 weeks. In that sample size, an average of 8 targets, 6 catches, but only for 46 yards per game and 1 touchdown. So not quite the same player this season, but against Denver in general, he usually goes over 70 yards. I think that is something to buy into. I think the floor is decent for Jakobi this week, but that touchdown feels hard to trust in that offense. At number 29, I rank DK Metcalf versus Arizona, and I would be concerned about Metcalf a lot because JSN clearly has overtaken him. I think JSN is way more safe at this point, and Metcalf has always been someone I thought was overrated in general. He has been very disappointing based on the contract and all the hype. Maybe he fell to the 4th round for a reason after all. But in his last 5 games versus the Arizona Cardinals, he plays like shit. An average of 6.3 points per game, only 1 touchdown in those 5 games, 7.6 targets, 3.4 catches for 34 yards. They lock him up every single time. And it's not like the Cardinals have a good secondary. This is kind of shocking. Like, if it was against Jalen Ramsey, we would kind of understand. But there's nobody since Patrick Peterson in Arizona that scares you. And these numbers, I don't believe, include Patrick Peterson's tenure in Arizona. So kind of shocking, an organization that just knows him too well, really shuts him down. And that's why I think he's a very bad play this week. I'd much rather go with JSN over Metcalf, but odds are you don't have both. And if you have Metcalf, then you probably think I'm ranking him too low. The target volume has been there. It's still an average of 8.5 targets per game, 6 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown. The last 4 weeks, that does average 11.3 points per game. That is the wide receiver 20 in points per game. So I am downgrading him significantly because of the matchup stats. That's kind of the only reason why I can explain it, but I'm trusting it. I don't think he's the safest play, just a low-end flex option in a tough week at the position. Number 30, I'm only ranking him here on name value. I kind of want to rank Deebo like 15 spots lower. He's been terrible. The wide receiver 46 in points per game over his last 4 games. 6.7 is trash. So what are you getting from him? Without a touchdown, you're getting almost nothing, an average of 46 yards per game. He does not look like the same player this season. Maybe it's the pneumonia that's still lingering. I mean, recovering from that is no joke. So maybe that's a real reason why he's playing so bad. But he really let me down last week. I apologize for endorsing him so high. He normally completely dominates Seattle. So sometimes these matchup stats are on point. Other times they are very misleading because history sometimes does change. So hoping for the best here. Deebo plays okay against the Packers, though. It's not a divisional matchup, but in 4 career games versus Green Bay, Deebo does average 9.9 points per game with only 1 touchdown. He usually has a safe floor, but not a massive ceiling. So I definitely prefer Jauan Jennings in this matchup. And I do think Deebo is a bit of a liability. The matchup's also bottom 3. If Jair is healthy, you would expect he'd probably lock up Deebo a bit more than Jennings. So I'm definitely worried at number 30. Just like DK Metcalf, I think you could get absolutely burned for only 6.5 points from both of these players. But based on name value and where you drafted them, I think odds are you're starting them. Look at the names below them. Are you really going to start Quentin Johnston over Deebo or DK Metcalf this week? I don't think so. So that's why I rank him there in the top 30. But I am worried about both guys a lot this week. Like I mentioned at 31, I do have QJ versus the Ravens, and the matchup is so good. That's why I am upgrading him. But Quentin has actually been really good the last 4 games with 3 touchdowns, 53 yards per game, an average of 11.2 points per game. So yes, he's touchdown dependent. The volume isn't insane, but when he catches it, they're usually deep down the field, and he does offer a lot of yards after the catch. So when he does get the ball, it often finds pay dirt. Quentin Johnston has the most touchdowns of any receiver in LA this year. So I think he's an interesting option. Definitely a good matchup here. Definitely one to chase. The Ravens can't stop anyone. They give up 200 yards per game to wide receivers the last 5 weeks. So I think Quentin Johnston is very appealing. I think he is an interesting flex option. I almost ranked him above Deebo Samuel. At number 32, I think from a floor standpoint, Elijah Moore is very safe. I almost ranked him back to back to back with Jeudy and Tillman. He scored a touchdown last week. Tillman did not. And the target share is actually favoring Elijah Moore even over Jeudy the last 4 games. Elijah averaging 9.9 points in that sample size, 9 targets, 5.8 catches, 55 yards, and 1 touchdown. He's more of the check down guy compared to Tillman and Jeudy down the field. So if you're getting less than 10 yards per catch, that's why I'm pumping the brakes. He's more of a floor play, but he is the wide receiver 29 in points per game the last 4 weeks of all eligible players this week. So I think he's a good option. I think you're not going to get burned at all with Elijah Moore. I think worst case scenario, he puts up the stat line you got from Tillman last week, which was 4 catches for 47 yards, 6.7 points from Tillman, I think is the floor for Elijah Moore. But maybe the touchdown goes back to him. Maybe he has that double-digit ceiling again. But in general, I'd be starting Jeudy and Tillman for sure in this offense. And then in flex consideration, I think Elijah Moore is a bust-proof option, good for relatively 8 or 9 points week to week. So go ahead and start him. I think he's a good pickup. He's still available on a lot of waiver wires at the moment. At number 33, I have Rome Odunze versus the Vikings, and Rome was the number 1 target for Caleb in the new look offense last week. Without Shane Waldron, they did get Rome involved a little bit more. But perhaps it involved the tough matchup for DJ Moore. I'm not quite ready to establish Rome above DJ in the rankings, but he's only 6 spots behind him. I do think Rome is picking up steam, and I would absolutely trust Rome Odunze way more than Keenan Allen. The matchup here against the Vikings is top 13, and with 4 better matchups unavailable, it does rank top 9 on the week. So one of the few good options. The Vikings give up just under 29 points per game for 10.6 catches, 160 yards per game, and 6 touchdowns. That's over 15 yards per catch. I do think Odunze can do some damage down the field in this matchup. So if the target share continues, he's actually been the number 1 target in this offense since the last 4 games. And with no touchdowns, he still offers an 8.3 point floor on 62 yards per game. So I trust him from a floor standpoint. I think Rome is starting to get his footing in the NFL. And if the touchdown does hit, I think you'll be very happy. You could go over 15 points easily with Rome Odunze this week. Love the matchup. And I would start him if I was desperate. But I'd rather go Quentin Johnston or Elijah Moore. There's still some options off the wire that are a bit more interesting. At 34, I have Romeo Doubs, followed by Jayden Reed and Christian Watson, all 3 Packers receivers back to back to back here. 34 through 36. I really think it's a toss-up which one has the best game. Last week it was Christian Watson, who did have 150 yards, but no touchdowns. So he is averaging 7.3 points per game the last 4, but obviously it's very skewed based on last week. Meanwhile, Romeo Doubs is also averaging 7.3 points as well. The 2 are deadlocked over the last 4 games. Neither has a touchdown. Both have over 50 yards per game, but Doubs has a few more targets. He does lead the team in targets this year. So that's why I'm still going to rank Doubs number 1. I see the safest floor for him, but obviously last week it's not like that was a safe floor at all. He barely had 1 catch for like 10 yards. So you could get burned from any of these players. I think Jayden Reed is the most interesting in terms of ceiling, but he's the only one with a touchdown the last 4 games, and he has the least yards among them. So the fewest targets. He does get involved in the run game sometimes, but it's kind of just a Russian roulette here. There's a chance that Dontavian Wicks has the blow-up game, and Tucker Kraft vultures the only touchdown available. So all 3 of them could be trash, but one of them could be fantastic. If you get the game from Watson last week again, you'd be very happy. So buyer beware, definitely some risk involved with all three options, but it's the Packers offense. There's always some upside. It's starting to feel like the only one that's safe to play, though, is Josh Jacobs. Everyone else is a liability because it just pivots from player to player every single week. There's no rhyme or reason what will happen for sure. But another reason why I rank Dobbs above the other two as a tiebreaker is because last year in the playoffs, he was the only one with a good stat line. Dobbs had 4 catches on 6 targets, 83 yards, no touchdown, and that was 10.3 fantasy points. Meanwhile, Jaden Reed only had 6.4 points in that playoff game, 4 catches for 44 yards, and Christian Watson was terrible, only 1 catch for 11 yards in that playoff loss to the Niners back in January. So that's why I'm ranking Romeo at number 1. He sees the most targets, but it's kind of irrelevant. You kind of just need one of them to score a touchdown, and you need to pick correctly. Good luck. That's why I rank them all back to back to back. Whichever one you start has just the same chance of playing great as playing terrible. Number 37, I have Xavier Worthy at Carolina. And if you're willing to start a Packers receiver, I think you can also justify starting Xavier Worthy. Last week, it was the right call. He had a very good game against the Bills. However, I don't trust it week to week. The volume's just not there. And even when it is, he's not a safe bet to catch it. He could give you like 10 yards in any game and like nothing in fantasy. He could also give you 20 points in fantasy the following week on 2 touchdowns on just like two plays with like 80 yards because he's that explosive. So definitely boom bust with Worthy. Definitely worth it if it pays off. But in general, it's a little too hard to trust. I'd rather start Hopkins if I was starting a Chiefs receiver. But maybe it's going to start pivoting back to him. He is a number 1 first round pick after all. And perhaps he's finally comfortable in the NFL. At number 38, I have Jaylen Waddle versus the Patriots, and I was tempted to rank him a lot higher because similar to Tyreek Hill, he plays way better at home versus New England than he does on the road. If we look at the last 5 games versus New England, he averages 7.2 points per game, but only isolating the last 2 games versus New England at home in Miami. Holy shit, really good numbers here. 8.5 targets per game, 5.5 catches per game, 95 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns. That's an average of 18.3 points per game. Jaylen Waddle plays excellent at home versus New England. So I kind of want to give him the same upgrade I gave Tyreek Hill. If that was the case, I'd probably rank him top 20. There's a world where Waddle absolutely goes off, but he's just been so bad this season. I really have a hard time believing it. And in the past, Jonnu Smith was not a factor at all. Jonnu played lights out last week and has been very steadily increasing his target share over the last month or so. And it feels like Jonnu has overtaken Waddle in this offense. So I am very concerned about that. I think the floor is non-existent for Waddle, and you're really just hoping for this ceiling to happen again. But similar to Tyreek, it's definitely possible. I could be way too low on Waddle this week, but he's been so bad, such a liability in your offense. I don't trust him. He's the wide receiver 49 in points per game the last month. Only 6.2 points is terrible. So similar to Worthy, it could really pay off. You could be very happy if you start him. You could also, more likely than not, be very upset and get burned for less than 5 points. So good luck if you're going to start him. I think you got to be pretty desperate to trust Waddle at this point. But if you're that desperate, why not pivot to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine at Houston? I know last week with a 98-yard reception, that's not something you expect to repeat at all. But what I do think is legit is the fact that he has 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games. They definitely use him a lot in the red zone in this offense. So while Ridley has way more volume, he usually doesn't score that many touchdowns. When they get in the red zone, they look for Westbrook-Ikhine. So I think if you're just gambling for touchdowns at this point, if you're willing to start Worthy and Waddle, I think Westbrook-Ikhine is an interesting option as well. His last 4 games versus the Texans in his career, he averages 9.3 points against them, 60 yards and 1 touchdown in that sample size as well. He actually plays very well against the Texans historically. So if these touchdowns continue, then I think Ikhine might be too low in the rankings. He actually ranks as number 16 in points per game at wide receiver the last 4 games. 11.9 points is his average in that sample size. So don't dismiss him. Obviously, it's risky, but the Texans are a top 2 matchup. There's a world where he plays very well. Yet again, don't be shocked if he goes over 10 points with another touchdown. At number 40, I have Darius Slayton versus Tampa Bay, and the matchup's pretty decent. Slayton, though, is a deep threat, and that's kind of the only way it pays off. So DeVito will need to connect down the field. You'll probably need a 50-yard catch. Without it, I doubt Slayton goes over 6 points. At 41, that's kind of the name of the game with Addison as well. He had a deep touchdown against the Titans last week. Without it, not very much, but it could happen again. It's definitely an interesting bet to make. And similar to Worthy and Waddle, that's kind of the name of the game at this point. Good luck if you're starting Addison. At 42, I have Alec Pierce versus Detroit, followed by Michael Pittman right behind him. And I don't trust Pittman at all. Pittman's been brutal, no touchdowns the last 4 games, an average of 4.7 in fantasy. Meanwhile, we know Alec Pierce is also very risky, but he's actually been the one that has that upside this season. He has all the deep catches and all those house call touchdowns. Like Alec Pierce, when he plays well, does go off. Last week, he had 74 yards and could happen again. I definitely feel like there's more of a reason to bet on Pierce right now than Pittman. Like with Pittman, there's just no upside. You think he's the better option. He gets more targets, but it doesn't turn into any actual production. I think the ceiling's very low with Pittman. While the floor is non-existent with Pierce, the ceiling is what I want. The ceiling and the upside is why I would start him. So with that upside in mind, you're hoping for that deep touchdown. I think Alec Pierce is a better option than Pittman, but outside the top 40, both are pretty risky. I'd probably bench both of them if I could. The only one I trust would be Josh Downs. At 44, I have Rashad Bateman at the Chargers, and the matchup's top 10. Bateman's also one of those deep threat touchdown waiting to happen, and that's what you're hoping for if you start Bateman. But not the worst bet. I could see a shootout on Monday night. At 45, I have Devon Valley at Las Vegas, who is not a player to dismiss at all. The wide receiver 45, averaging 6.7 points per game his last 4, with a touchdown in that span. He's not bad. He's 6'4", and I think the targets can continue, especially in the red zone. I think they will keep him involved. Bo Nix does like him. So Valley sometimes gets more than like 6-8 targets sometimes, and behind Sutton, I think he's the only trustworthy option in Denver. But at 45, not the highest ceiling, I'd probably bench him if I can. But Sutton does play very poorly historically against the Raiders. Perhaps Valley steps up if Sutton struggles again. At 46 and 47, I have the 2 Panthers receivers, Xavier Legette and Adam Thielen versus the Chiefs, and I don't know for sure who's the number 1 target in this offense this week. Thielen is expected to play. He's been cleared to play by the doctor. He's been on IR since like week 3, and he was already limited in practice on Wednesday. So I am expecting Thielen to suit up, and that does throw a bit of a wrench into this offense. I think Legette is the better option. Definitely a bit more interesting for touchdown production. That's usually what Legette offers, not much else. But perhaps with no Deontay Johnson, Thielen could overtake Legette as the go-to option. We remember last year, Adam Thielen was heavily targeted and a very good player in fantasy football. So maybe it happens again. I doubt it. He's getting older, and off the hamstring injury, I'd be concerned he's not quite 100%. So I would still be starting Legette over Thielen this week, but odds are I'm not starting either of them. I would pick up Thielen, though, as an interesting stash. There's a chance he does get back to top 30 value pretty quickly. At 48, I have Josh Palmer versus the Ravens, who gets the best matchup on paper, so not a terrible dart throw, but obviously you probably need a touchdown to hit with Palmer. Against the Ravens, though, it's not the worst bet. They do give up over 200 yards to the position every week. At 49, I have Demarcus Robinson versus Philadelphia, who could maybe get back in the end zone. We saw those 4 touchdowns in 2 games recently, but since then it has dried up. He has not found pay dirt since that happened. So definitely risky. The matchup against the Eagles is very scary. However, they're a lot more difficult against Puka and Cooper Kupp. They don't have a third corner that really scares you that much. So maybe they're so focused on those other 2 options, DeMarcus does slip past them. There is a chance that Robinson is the best play in LA on Sunday night. At 50, I have Kevontae Turpin at Washington, who on Monday had a house call from like 60 yards out. That's all you're hoping for. He has the speed to do it, though. I wouldn't be shocked if Turpin does it again. These last 10, though, I think are a little too risky to bet on, but I will rank them. I will mention them, but I'd rather wait and see. I would keep them on the bench, if not the waiver wire. At 51, I have Ricky Pearsall at Green Bay, who put up a bagel last week, so not trustworthy, but interesting pickup. I don't want to give up on him entirely, but last week was way too risky to trust. Number 52, I have Keenan Allen, who is not the player I want at all in Chicago. It's either DJ Moore or Rome Odunze, and both of them are also risky. I'm not betting on Keenan Allen. At 53, I have Tyler Lockett versus Arizona, and with the emergence of JSN and DK Metcalf healthy again, I think I can finally say Lockett is clearly the number 3 and not safe to start. Lockett is the odd man out at this point in the season. At 54, I have Kendrick Bourne, followed by Demario Douglas and Kayshon Boutte, all 3 New England Patriots receivers, and this is a bit of an audition this week. One of these 3 players I think could have value. Last week, it was Kendrick Bourne, but Douglas sees the most targets. Meanwhile, Boutte has been consistently giving you about 30-35 yards per game. So they're all somewhat involved. At some point, Drake May will favor one by far over another, but because their offense is still too crowded, the only pass catcher I trust is Henry, the tight end, because the bar is so much lower at that position. So not expecting enough from these 3, but interesting guys to keep an eye out for. There's a chance one of them does have value rest of season. At 57, I have Wan'Dale Robinson versus Tampa, and with Tommy DeVito, I'm not quite ready to trust it. I would rather go Slayton if I was starting anyone other than Nabers in this receiving core. At 58, I got Michael Wilson at Seattle, and you're hoping for a touchdown. The matchup is top 5, but Michael Wilson played much better at home last season as a rookie versus the Seahawks than on the road. I would pass on Michael Wilson. I'd also pass on Jalen McMillan, who maybe plays better now that the corners will be focused on Mike Evans. Maybe he gets open a bit more, but he's done nothing this season. I don't trust him. Need a touchdown from McMillan. You need that deep shot to hit. And same applies with Mike Williams. He did it a couple weeks ago, but has really dried up since then. Russ, though, could make it happen. The matchup is also top 4 against Cleveland. So that's going to be it for this video. Here are my top 60 receiver rankings at the position. And like I mentioned, some of the best matchups are unavailable. So I do worry about it. There are some really bad matchups for good players, like Puka against Quinyon Mitchell does scare me a lot, but I think everyone in the top 10 is obviously a must start. The volume for them has been so good. I'm definitely trusting them in my lineup. You cannot bench any of those names, but starting with JSN at number 11, I feel like there's a lot of upside still left on the board, and I could see well over 15 points from everyone from JSN all the way through Ridley. I think once we hit Josh Downs, it's a bit more of a floor type of play, but I still think double digits is a safe projection. So these are more so my flex plays this week, all the way from Josh Downs down to Elijah Moore, Rome Odunze. I think that is the cutoff point. That is the last player I project to give you at least 10 points at receiver. So while I am worried about guys like DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel, as well as even DeAndre Hopkins and DeVonta Smith, I still think they've done enough in their careers or just this season to trust them in your lineup. Those are the flex plays, in my opinion. Once we hit the Packers receivers, after that point, you are gambling, you need a touchdown, and odds are you get burned. So buyer beware, definitely good luck if you are starting one of those players, but only the top 33, I think, have safe value this week. Those are the guys I'm considering in my lineup. So good luck to you. If you still have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below, and I will answer them before Thursday kickoff, if not Sunday, depending on when you ask it. But that's going to be it for me. I've done with this video. My name's Adam Riancho. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.